Flight 709 had been cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet, cutting across the early evening sky like a silver arrow, drifting above layers of soft clouds glowing in the fading sunlight. Passengers were relaxed, some asleep, some scrolling on their phones, a few chatting quietly while the hum of the engines created a gentle background lullaby. Everything felt normal, almost too normal, until it happened. Without warning, a violent shudder tore through the aircraft, jolting every seat, rattling every overhead compartment, and instantly snapping the calm atmosphere in half. Lights flickered once, then twice, plunging the cabin into a brief, terrifying semi-darkness before emergency lights flicked on with a cold, red glow. The sudden drop in altitude made stomachs twist, drinks spill, and passengers gasp as oxygen masks deployed with loud pops, dangling like eerie yellow fruit from the ceiling. A wave of panic rushed through the cabin. The quiet murmurs exploded into terrified screams. Trembling hands grabbed frantically for masks. Children cried uncontrollably, and people pressed against their seats, praying, pleading, or frozen in shock. Through the chaos, a flight attendant sprinted down the aisle, her face pale, her voice shaking despite trying to keep it steady. She leaned close to the senior attendant near the galley, whispering something urgent, something that instantly drained the color from both their faces. And then she said it loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear, words that spread through the plane like wildfire. "The captain is incapacitated. We need help." Those 7 words shattered whatever fragile composure remained in the cabin. People gasped, some screamed louder, a few covered their faces in despair, and others clutched the armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. The idea of thousands of feet of empty sky beneath them, with no pilot in control, was enough to unravel even the bravest hearts. Every passenger reacted, every single one except the girl in row 14. Amidst the shaking cabin, the chaos and the suffocating fear, she sat still, almost unnaturally calm. While people around her pulled oxygen masks with trembling hands, she simply watched, her eyes sharp but serene, her posture steady, her breathing controlled as if she had trained for moments. Exactly like this, she didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't even flinch. Instead, she observed everything: the flickering lights, the attendants rushing back and forth, the terrified passengers absorbing the situation piece by piece with an almost clinical calmness. The man sitting beside her was hyperventilating, whispering prayers under his breath, while the woman in front was shaking so badly she couldn't fit the mask over her child's face. But the girl in row 14, quiet, composed, steady, simply reached over and helped the woman secure the mask for her child, her hands gentle yet confident. Her calmness was so out of place that for a brief moment the people nearest to her forgot their own fear and stared at her instead. It wasn't the calmness of someone in denial, nor the numbness of shock. It was the calmness of someone who understood the gravity of the situation and had already begun thinking clearly through it. She pushed her own mask on, tightened the straps, and glanced down the aisle where the flight attendants were frantically trying to communicate with the cockpit. Every attempt was met with silence. The realization spread like a cold shadow: there was no captain responding. Turbulence rocked the plane again, making overhead bins rattle and passenger screams rise in a painful harmony. Some were shaking uncontrollably, others frozen, others crying loudly, but the girl in row 14 remained as still as a stone. Her hands were steady, her eyes focused, her body anchored in place, as if refusing to let fear claim even a fraction of her mind. The flight attendant closest to her stopped for a split second to catch her breath, her eyes darting nervously. The girl looked up at her, and for a moment their eyes met. Something in the girl's expression, certainty, confidence, something unexplainable, made the attendant pause. Then the girl spoke, her voice low but unwavering, cutting through the noise around them like a steady current. "Tell me exactly what's happening." The attendant swallowed hard, her voice shaking as she replied. The captain collapsed. "The co-pilot is trying to regain control, but they need assistance, Every second counts. More turbulence hit the plane, sending a ripple of gasps through the cabin. But the girl didn't even blink. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself, then looked down the aisle toward the cockpit door at the far end. Chaos surrounded her, but in her mind everything was settling into clarity. She unbuckled her seat belt, not with urgency but with intention, her movements smooth and controlled while everyone else was scrambling or crying. People around her watched confused, wondering why she wasn't panicking like everyone else, why she wasn't frozen with fear. But she didn't owe them an explanation. She had already made up her mind. The girl stood up, bracing herself against the shaking cabin, and said quietly yet firmly, just loud enough for the terrified people around her to hear, "Stay calm, I'm going to help." For a moment the passengers near her fell silent, stunned not by her words, but by the certainty with which she said them. It wasn't a plea, nor a guess, nor hope. It was a decision. She stepped into the aisle, balancing herself as the plane trembled again. Passengers stared at her, some with confusion, others with disbelief, a girl barely 19, walking toward the cockpit as if stepping into destiny. Row by row, she moved forward, her steady presence cutting through the waves of panic like a knife. In a plane full of fear, she was the only point of calm, and no one yet understood how much that calm was about to change everything. Passengers were crying, praying, shouting, clutching each other as if the world was ending, but in the middle of all that chaos, while the cabin shook, alarms wailed, and oxygen masks swung wildly, she stood up slowly, almost defiantly, as if refusing to let fear dictate her next move. The passengers nearest to her watched with wide, trembling eyes, not understanding how someone so young could rise so calmly while everyone else was falling apart. Her movements were deliberate, not rushed, not frantic, but controlled, as though she had rehearsed this moment all her life, or as though she carried some quiet certainty the others did not. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the panic like a sharp beam of light, slicing through storm clouds, clear, steady, and impossibly composed. "Move aside, I can help." The words didn't match the situation, didn't match her age, didn't match anything anyone expected, and that mismatch stunned everyone around her. For a moment the chaos dimmed, the screaming softened, and several passengers simply stared at her, their faces pale, damp with tears, and twisted with confusion. Who was she? Why wasn't she shaking like the rest of them? And how could she say something so bold at a time when the plane felt like it might fall out of the sky? People looked at her like she had lost her mind, like she was clinging to some impossible fantasy of heroism, because who in their right mind would believe a 19-year-old girl could help fly a commercial airliner thousands of feet above the earth in the middle of a life-threatening emergency? Yet there was something in her eyes, something sharp, focused, unwavering, that made even the doubters pause. Fear was everywhere, mothers clinging to their children, elderly passengers whispering prayers into trembling hands, men gripping the seatbacks as if holding the plane up themselves. But none of that fear touched her. Her expression held none of the panic that choked the cabin. Instead, there was an unshakable calmness, a kind of internal stillness that contrasted so violently with the surrounding chaos that it almost frightened the others more than the turbulence itself. One woman, tears streaming down her face, actually stepped aside instinctively, as though her body recognized authority her mind hadn't processed yet. A man tried to protest, sputtering, "You're just a kid, sit down," but even he sounded unsure, his voice cracking under the weight of his own terror. She met his gaze, and something in her eyes, an anchor of confidence, made him falter, his argument dissolving into a helpless whisper. The plane jolted again, the cabin lights flickering, prompting new waves of screams, but she didn't so much as blink. That composure alone seemed unreal, almost superhuman, and it made people wonder if she knew something they didn't. Her height, her slim frame, her youth, none of it matched the authority in her voice. But leadership doesn't always come from size or age. sometimes it comes from presence, and she had that in a way no one else did. As she moved forward, each step steady despite the trembling floor, passengers continued to stare, whispers rippling behind her like a confused, fearful tide. Is she serious? Where is she going? Can she really help? But no one stopped her, no one had the courage, or perhaps no one had the hope left, to stand in her way. In emergencies, people cling to anything that looks like strength, and right now, she was the only thing in the entire cabin that resembled strength. A baby cried loudly as the plane jolted again, and the mother holding him looked up, tears streaking her cheeks, and saw the girl passing. For a moment, just a brief heartbeat, the mother felt relief wash over her, not because she believed the girl could save them, but because the girl made her believe someone could. That feeling spread quietly through the rows as eyes followed her. Hope, thin, fragile, trembling, began to stir. She reached for the overhead compartment briefly to steady herself, her fingers closing around the edge with a certainty that travelers usually only have on solid ground, not in a failing aircraft. Her posture remained upright, her breathing measured, and even though the plane trembled violently enough that other passengers clung desperately to their seats, she walked with the balance of someone unafraid. It was that fearlessness that made people move aside, not her words, not her age, but the energy she carried, the confidence pouring off her in waves strong enough to cut through panic. Someone muttered, 19, she must be joking, but the girl was already walking past them, her steps unwavering. She wasn't joking, she wasn't guessing, she wasn't desperate, she was certain, and that certainty was what they needed. Another man tried to grab her arm, his hand shaking, his voice pleading, no. Please just sit, please. But she gently pulled her arm free, not with force, but with calm intention, like someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. She didn't look back at him, she didn't look back at anyone. She kept her eyes forward toward the cockpit door, toward the place where chaos needed clarity most. Her age, just 19, didn't matter. The passengers didn't know her background, her training, her reasons. They didn't know why she was calm when everyone else was breaking. But they didn't need to. What they saw was enough. In a sky full of terror, she was the only person standing tall, steady, and ready. And without knowing why, without fully believing it, without even trusting themselves, they began to trust her. Because sometimes, in a moment when the world is falling apart, hope doesn't arrive as an expert or a hero. Sometimes hope stands up from row 14, brushing off fear like dust, and says in a calm, steady voice, move aside, I can help. She stepped into the cockpit for the first time in her life, and the moment the door shut behind her, she felt as though she had crossed into another universe, one filled with flashing red lights, shrill alarms, trembling instruments, and an overwhelming sense of urgency that pressed down on the air like invisible weight. The cockpit was shaking from turbulence so violently the seats rattled, warning messages blinked across every screen, and the autopilot had already disengaged, leaving the aircraft vulnerable and unstable. The co-pilot was slumped in his seat, half conscious, fighting to remain awake but losing the battle. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, and sweat dripped from his brow as he tried to lift a hand toward the controls but couldn't. She assessed him in a heartbeat, not in panic, but with a swift, sharp clarity that surprised even herself. She stepped past his seat, grabbed the empty captain's chair, and lowered herself into it, feeling its weight, its history, its responsibility settling onto her shoulders in an instant. Her heart should have been racing, her hands should have been trembling, her breath should have been ragged, but somehow none of that happened. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her mind laser focused. The cockpit shook again as turbulence tossed the plane like a helpless leaf, and several alarms screamed simultaneously, overlapping in a chaotic harmony that was enough to paralyze most people with fear, but she didn't freeze. She reached for the headset with deliberate calm, her fingers brushing against buttons she had only ever seen in movies or textbooks, not in reality, not in a moment where lives depended on them. The headset felt heavier than she expected, cold against her skin as she slid it over her ears. For a brief moment the world outside vanished. The cabin noise, the screams, the shaking, it all faded into the background. All she could hear now was the static filled frequency of air traffic control, a lifeline floating through chaos. She leaned forward, her voice steady, almost eerily controlled for someone with no flight training, and said the words that would define the moment forever. Control, this is passenger assistance. Talk me through this. The tower went silent for a heartbeat, an entire second of stunned disbelief. She imagined the controllers staring at each other, wondering if they had heard wrong, wondering who this girl was, why she sounded so calm while everything around her screamed disaster. When the controller finally responded, his voice cracked not from fear but from shock. Passenger assistance, repeat who is speaking. She tightened her grip on the yoke, feeling the aircraft sway beneath her, and replied, a passenger in the cockpit. Both pilots are incapacitated. I need you to guide me through this. Another long pause, too long. The alarms blared louder as though demanding attention. The turbulence hit harder. Lights flickered across the control panels. And for a moment she felt the plane dip too sharply and force the yoke back with instinct, steadying the descent without even knowing how she knew to do it. The controller must have heard the sudden drop in altitude because his next words were urgent, almost panicked. Okay, stay with me. Don't touch anything else. Keep your hands steady on. Yoke, tell me what's your name. She didn't answer the question. Her focus was locked on the instruments, trying to make sense of numbers, arrows, gauges all screaming for attention. Tell me what to do, she said instead, not with impatience but with clarity. The controller took a breath. She could hear it through the headset, and in that one breath he accepted the reality of the situation. He was speaking not to a trained pilot, not to a crew member, but to a 19-year-old girl who had stepped into the cockpit of a failing aircraft with 200 lives depending on her. All right, he said finally, his voice steadying, becoming firm, professional. I'm going to guide you through every move. First, look at your main display. Do you see the artificial horizon? Her eyes flicked over the chaotic array of screens until she found it, the blue over brown semicircle wobbling as the plane rolled. I see it, she replied. Good, keep the wings level, gently correct whenever it tilts. Don't fight the turbulence, just counter it. She followed his instructions immediately, adjusting the yoke with careful, deliberate movements. The aircraft responded, stabilizing slightly. The controller exhaled audibly, a small, stunned sound of relief. Okay, good, you're doing fine. Now tell me your altitude. She scanned the panel until she found the altimeter. 34,000 dropping, right, he said, thinking fast. We need to slow that descent. Pull back on the yoke just a touch, not too much or you'll stall. She pulled back carefully, feeling the vibration of the yoke through her hands, sensing the aircraft straining but responding. The alarms adjusted their pitches, some fading into silence, others continuing to flash warnings, but the plane began to level out. The controller's voice returned, steadier now, more assured. You're doing great. Now check your speed indicator. She found it. It's high, she said. Too high, yes, he replied. You need to reduce throttle. Look to your left, 2 levers, gently, very gently. Pull them back just a little. She reached for the levers, her fingers wrapping around them with caution. A tiny adjustment, and she felt the engines respond. The aircraft slowed incrementally, just enough to stop the alarming descent rate. Good, the controller said again, calmer now but still in awe. You're responding exactly as instructed. Keep listening, we're going to get you through this. She nodded even though he couldn't see her, her eyes darting over the flashing instruments as she processed each sound, each movement, each instruction with a precision she didn't know she possessed. Another jolt of turbulence hit the plane, but she corrected it instantly, almost intuitively. The controller noticed. Where did you learn to do that? He asked, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. Nowhere, she answered honestly. Just tell me what's next. And in that moment, the controller knew this girl was not ordinary. She was not panicking, not freezing, not collapsing under pressure. She was carrying the responsibility of the cockpit with the steadiness of someone born for it. He took a breath and then said, "All right, let's bring this aircraft under control. You're in charge now. I'll guide you all the way." Minutes felt like hours, but she did it. In that cramped cockpit filled with flashing reds, soft buzzing, and the faint groans of metal resisting turbulence, she kept her hands steady, her breathing controlled, her mind locked onto every instruction the controller fed through the headset. Outside the windows, the sky churned with thick, unsettled clouds, streaks of fading sunlight cutting through them like blades, but inside her chest there was a stillness that defied the storm. Every small adjustment she made, each careful pull of the yoke, each precise correction to throttle or pitch, felt like pushing back against the chaos of the universe itself. There were moments the plane dipped too sharply, moments alarms shrieked again, moments the co-pilot stirred in pain, reminding her how alone she was in that seat. Yet she didn't freeze, not once. She listened, she responded, she acted. The controller's voice became her anchor, guiding her through each wave of turbulence. Ease it good, hold it there, correct left, perfect, you're stabilizing. And she was. Slowly, impossibly, miraculously, the aircraft began to level, the nose rising just enough to flatten the descent, the wings steadying beneath her touch. The shaking dulled from violent to mild, the plane's roll corrected, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the artificial horizon steadied into its calm, even split. One by one, the alarms silenced themselves, their urgent warnings fading into a hum, then a quiet glow, and finally stillness. The silence that replaced them was almost louder than the noise. She exhaled, a soft, controlled release of breath that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The entire aircraft felt different, less like a falling machine, and more like a living being catching its breath alongside her. Even the co-pilot, still groggy and half-conscious, turned his head weakly toward her, disbelief flickering across his exhausted eyes. For the first time since she stepped into the cockpit, she allowed herself to glance back toward the sealed door that separated her from the terrified passengers. She imagined them gripping seats, whispering prayers, holding hands, and feeling every second stretch into eternity. They didn't know what was happening up here. They didn't know a 19-year-old girl had been holding their fate in her hands. They only knew fear, but that fear was about to break. After confirming with the controller that the plane was now stable and safe for the moment, she carefully removed the headset, the faint warmth of the ear pads lingering against her skin as she set it down. The cockpit felt strangely peaceful now, like a storm had passed, leaving behind clear air and quiet skies. She stood up slowly, her legs a little unsteady, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. Her hand brushed the back of the captain's seat, an acknowledgement of the responsibility she had just carried. Then, steadying herself, she turned toward the cockpit door. The cabin was silent, eerily, impossibly silent when she opened it. The instant the door cracked open, every head snapped toward her. Hundreds of eyes widened, breaths caught, hands froze midair. She stepped out into that sea of stunned faces, her posture calm, her expression composed, her presence radiating something no words could fully describe. People blinked as though they were seeing an illusion, a 19-year-old girl standing there as if she had simply gone to fetch a glass of water instead of stabilizing a massive aircraft at 34,000 feet. The silence swelled, thick and tense, pressing against every row. A flight attendant took a small step toward her, tears gathering in her eyes as she whispered, Is it okay? Did you?" The girl nodded once, gently but firmly. "It's stable now, you're safe." And that was all it took to break the silence. The entire cabin erupted not just in applause, but in a wave of raw, overwhelming emotion. Relief poured out of people like a flood bursting through a dam. Some stood up, clapping with trembling hands. Others covered their faces, sobbing into the palms that had moments ago been clenched in terror. A child raised both arms like she was seeing a superhero. An elderly man pressed his hand to his heart, tears streaming down his cheeks. The applause grew louder, thunderous, echoing through the fuselage with a force that felt almost spiritual. People weren't just clapping. They were thanking her with every bit of their being, thanking her for stepping up, for staying calm, for not letting fear take over when everyone else thought the end had come. The flight attendants looked at her with awe, as though witnessing something impossible. She stood there quietly, letting the waves of gratitude wash over her. But there was no pride in her expression, only a soft, humble certainty that she had done what needed to be done. No theatrics, no dramatic gestures, just calm, just courage, just clarity. She didn't just stay calm, she saved them all. And in that moment, standing in the aisle of a plane that minutes ago was on the verge of disaster, she became something more than a passenger, more than a 19-year-old girl. She became the reason 200 people would go home that night. The applause continued, echoing through the cabin like a heartbeat restored, and she allowed herself, just for a second, to close her eyes and breathe, deep and full, as the peace she had fought for finally settled around her.